Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Of course, it's Inspired Conversations with Craig. And well, look, today I'm going to be sharing a website that I've been visiting multiple times per week over the past 6 years. It's the Vitamin D Wiki. There it is on screen. And I'm joined today by Mr. Henry Lahore. He is the founder of Vitamin D Wiki. There he is on screen. In this video, look, I'm going to give you an introduction to the wiki, and I'm going to probe this very knowledgeable man about some commonly asked questions around vitamin D and supplementation that I know will be of value to you if you're interested in exploring the literature. And we're going to wrap up with a philosophical round off and a where to from here for you, for me, for Henry, and the wikis. So, Henry, welcome to my podcast. And I've got to say, thank you so much for agreeing to come on and chat with me. Now, I'm told that you're a retired Boeing engineer. Tell us a little bit about that. For the folks at home, a little bit about yourself and your background into the world of vitamin D.
Sure. My background is electronics engineering and worked at Boeing, retired a few years ago. Had been interested in health all my life, been following many different nutritional supplements. I've probably tried over 100 of them during my life. Then got started with Vitamin D Wiki because a person told me he knew I was interested in health, that vitamin D was helping some people with back problems. And I've had back problems most of my life, and investigated it and found that indeed it was helping tremendously. And so while I was retired, I proceeded to get into studying through vitamin D. And about a month later, I started Vitamin D Wiki. And now we've got 13,000 web pages on vitamin D and other associated things on Vitamin D Wiki.
So when did you found the wiki? When did it all kick off?
It's about 2010 is the start date.
Right. And the motivation for doing it?
I wanted to share with other people around the world what I had learned about vitamin D. I had been sharing other things with some publications I made under a rubric of health prints, little bits of information, pamphlets about health, and I wanted to share things in a non-paper way that I could share it around the world about how much people can get benefit from vitamin D.
And so, look, I know the wiki is just this amazing place to find all the information on vitamin D. It's ranked by disease and disorder. Tell me, how does the back end work? Are you like literally spending all your time collating studies? And how many did you say were available?
There are 13,000 studies on the website. Most of them are available as full text, and about 10% of them I expand the full text so you can see it and actually have it translated into any of 105 languages. But great number of them are, the rest of them are attached there, and I just will show the abstract. It tends to take me about an hour to 3 hours to extract an entire study and put it on the web page. So I tend not to do that. I keep it more at like the 10-minute level. I spend of the order of about 2,000 hours each year at the master of the Vitamin D Wiki website.
And in terms of language, you did, I mean, you know, I'm coming from New Zealand. It's a very diverse society down this part of the world, Henry. We've got Maori and a lot of Asian, Chinese speaking people. Any one of those cultures can jump on the wiki and view any one of those pages in their language. Is that correct?
Yep. Here's the translate, and then you can select the languages that you want it to go to. There. So that's the list of languages. You just pick the language you want, and there's Bengali, and there it's translate that page to Bengali or any of 105 different languages, and it's done that quickly. And switch it again to to Arabic, for instance.
That's absolutely unreal in terms of connecting with a global audience. Now, you know my background into vitamin D, Henry, is cluster headache. Is there a mechanism for me to just look at everything relating to cluster headache or migraine disorder? So, I'm not so much interested in some of the other aspects, just headache.
There's about 140 categories of information of health problems that I've gotten a lot of information on where vitamin D is either involved in treating it or preventing it. And anyone can look at those 140 items. They'll be shown a little later here in the interview.
Right. And look, tell me, how many people are flocking to the wiki looking over your site?
Generally, only about 40,000 people per month. Haven't advertised it at all. They've got various methods of doing it. Haven't had the time to do any of the advertising.
Out of curiosity, where are those folks coming from?
Generally from English-speaking countries, but also got some from Spain, and seems as though some languages are being used from India, Philippines. I guess about 10% of them are from Germany. So assortment of places. I guess is of the order of about 40 countries. People come visit the website, but the ones there's a top 10 of countries that are most frequent.
Yeah. How does New Zealand appear on the list? Do you notice many folks from New Zealand coming in there?
Have not noticed.
Right.
I only look at that about once a year.
I say that because, look, it's a conversation that's coming up more and more down here as people become aware of the effects and benefits of vitamin D. Now, before I start to pick your brains, Henry, you're clearly a knowledgeable guy that's read more papers on the subject, certainly than I have. It's a timely reminder just to say that anything we discuss here, team, is certainly not to be construed as medical advice. It's for your educational purposes only, and I hope you take something of value away from it. Now, before I get started on some of the questions I get asked all the time about vitamin D, Henry, first, just tell me, what is all this fuss about? Why is it coming up in conversations more and more? And is it actually worth having a conversation about?
We wouldn't be having this conversation back in the 1970s. Most people around the world had a good level of vitamin D and were fairly healthy relative to what's happening now. Since that time, however, due to over 20 reasons that I've got documented on the website in detail, the vitamin D levels have been dropping or crashing tremendously. We'll be showing that later on here in the interview. The problems that there used not to be a need to supplement with vitamin D, but now that people primarily are staying indoors more and are fearful of getting vitamin D from the sun, they are causing a great number of other problems.
And you've got an amazing 5.5-minute video that I have posted. You can check that out, and it gives you just the most amazing background into into the world of deficiency, and it would lead into one of my first questions there, Henry. Vitamin D recommendations. What blood level should we be aiming for? And I can tell you, in New Zealand, I'm going to bring up New Zealand recommendations on screen for you folks at home. But we've got recommendations that seem very low when you compare them to, the Endocrinological Society's guidelines, and even then, there are recommendations that differ from this. So, as an ordinary, everyday kind of bloke, how am I supposed to navigate this, and where does the truth lie?
I like to think of, as I'm trying to tell this to different people, I like to think of what do other people around the world believe in a particular society, religion, vitamin D level, calories, alcohol, whatever. Not looking parochially at my particular country, but look at a wide variety of countries. So here in this chart that we're looking at, New Zealand's on the second row, along with the Institute of Medicine, Australia, New Zealand, Nordic countries. They're saying that at 50 nanomoles or 20 nanograms of vitamin D is sufficient. You're in the green region. Now, some other countries are even lower. You can be at the 30 nanomoles to be okay. The United Kingdom is even lower than that. But if you look around at the various countries around the world and groups around the world, you see that no, you can't get into the green level until you're about 75 nanomoles, which is 30 nanograms, or some of them say you need even higher than that to be in a good region. I personally think it should be even higher than that, but this is just a quick overview of there's almost an equal number of countries in each of those different categories where they think a certain level is okay.
And so in terms of, recommended daily intake, again, down here in New Zealand, the recommendation is between 200 and 400 international units of vitamin D. And, the maximum potency, I can tell you, if you walk into a chemist pharmacy, is 1,000 international units. Now, I think the burning question is, at that kind of dose level, is it significant enough to be able to increase your vitamin D serum level into the green range, like in that first table with the Vitamin D Council?
So here's a summary of a chart that I had looking at various recommendations around the world. I don't have New Zealand here explicitly, but it shows some of the others, and they're the higher up you are on the chart, some of them are at 2,000 IUs, and that there's some groups that say that's quite adequate. Some groups say you want 4,000 IUs as well. Actually, not adequate. They're referring to this as the upper maximum. Some say 2,000 maximum. Some say 4,000. Some say 10,000 maximum. But in all cases, it's actually the maximum is far, far higher than any of these, but just showing you the position that various of the groups around the world have taken as to what is a good level. There's probably 40 some countries that have 2,000 IUs as the maximum to take, and that's all that can be sold by companies inside of that country. Later on, you'll see that there's ways of getting a much larger doses of vitamin D to get a good amount by buying things internationally.
Yeah, right. So look, in my case, Henry, it's 80 nanograms per milliliter in order for me not to get cluster headache attacks. And it's as simple as that. Now, if I'd started off like the average Kiwi with a serum around 24, 25 nanograms per milliliter, would taking 1,000 or 2,000 international units of vitamin D get me to 80 nanograms per milliliter?
Putting it slightly differently, I rarely see a single study on any health problem that 1,000 IUs of vitamin D will help. 2,000 IUs, it starts to help on some problems, but things like cluster headaches, multiple sclerosis, sleep problems, and others need much, much higher doses to achieve that
And so I guess then the question becomes why the why behind why regulate the maximum dose that one can purchase if these lower doses aren't going to touch or elevate your level up to around what the vitamin D Council is now suggesting looks like optimal. It seems like you end up taking away a person's choice to choose what they do with their body. It seems almost ridiculous, to be fair.
Many doctors,
like, what's the risk? Why are they doing this?
It's based on a problem that came up in the 1950s in the United Kingdom. They had an outbreak of some problems, and they thought it was due to the vitamin D in milk that they had recently given. And they, at that point, then slammed down and said no vitamin D at all. And they greatly reduced how much vitamin D people could be having. Vitamin D was given to the tune of much higher doses, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 per day back in the 1930s, with excellent help to dental groups. There's quite a few studies of showing how the American Dental Association was strongly recommending a good level of vitamin D way back then. But due to that mistaken problem, which got perpetrated as being a problem in a great number of medical textbooks, that even up until 2 years ago, it was still saying that, oops, you could have toxic level of vitamin D if you have 2,000 IUs. Due to that mistake that was done back in the 1950s. Slowly, things are changing, but that's the problem.
Well, I mean, the offshoot of that is, I'm perplexed at the situation behind it all. But you look at this paper from the Journal of Health, Population, and Nutrition's 1 in 7 of us are now deficient in vitamin D, and that's about 1 billion human beings. If the recommended daily intakes are so low, it kind of, you start to get an understanding of why we have such a high level of deficiency down here in New Zealand. And again, I've got a link here for Kiwis that want to have a look at that now.
It really depends, Craig, on what your definition of deficiency is. Yes, about 1 in 7 or 10 are deficient if you have a very low level as to what you call deficient. But if you look it up at, say, 30 nanograms, if you're less than 30 nanograms, then it's around about 50% of the world is deficient. If you look at the level where you really should be, in the way where people used to be at 50 nanograms, then it's more like 90% of the world is deficient.
Yeah. So one of the things that I hear all the time when people start talking about vitamin D is you can get all the vitamin D that you need from the sun. So, how much is enough sun? And I prefaced that question, Henry, because I was reading a interview article in the New Zealand Stuff News publication looking at an increased risk of melanoma because more women are opting for G-string style bikinis. And the skin specialist went on to say that spending 2 sessions, 5 minutes per week is adequate for vitamin D production. Is that enough?
Not nearly enough. By the way, the main problem with skin problems, skin cancer, and vitamin D is when you go out there in the sun infrequently, and then all of a sudden you try and get a lot of vitamin D, and the sun, your skin is not used to it. If you go at it more gradually during the year and just get more and more and more, as you would normally if, say, you're an outdoor worker, you don't have any problems at all. My dad was a carpenter, for instance, and he would have no skin problems whatsoever because he was gradually, as the months were going along, getting more and more sun, and that builds up your vitamin D level in your skin. Once the vitamin D level in your skin is built up, it's able to deal with having more UV coming in. And so you have paradoxically less problems as you are more used to the sun. But people who only go out, say on the weekend, and try to get all their vitamin D at that particular time, that doesn't work out too well.
So in terms of, consistency of exposure, more so than, bursts over the summer break.
Right.
Yeah.
So for instance, the little chart I have there, it kind of works out that if your target is in the lower left-hand corner, 10 nanograms of vitamin D, then you probably 10 minutes will be enough for you per day during the summer. But if your target is more like 50 nanograms and you're trying to get it all from UV or from the sun, then it's more like 90 minutes that you have to have in order to get that 50 nanograms. And that's per each day. That's assuming, as I say in here, that it's a young person, white skin, lying down in a bathing suit. We're not all that way, of course, but
indeed, my eyebrows raised when I was reading the articles to suggest, two kind of 5-minute sessions was enough. And my mother and grandfather both died from melanoma, so it's not a conversation or a topic that I approach lightly at all. And it leads, I guess, on to my next question, because I'll have a lot of older folks, my mum's age, in their 60s and 70s, that perhaps watch this video and they're going to associate vitamin D with recommendations from their doctor regarding osteoporosis. And the classically understood function of vitamin D, of course, is in the regulation and mineralization of calcium and phosphorus. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, including why everyone talks about calcium and what is phosphorus and how does vitamin D kind of fit into that whole process?
I just noticed this morning, actually, that there were 20,000 published studies in the last decade on vitamin D in bones. So I will try to condense that down to a 30-second soundbite. That, yes, indeed, it's been noticed for a long time. It was first noticed 1905, I think it was, that vitamin D was given to people with rickets, that the rickets would go away. And then only 90 years later, people came up with a consensus that, yes, vitamin D does stop rickets. Well, that was the first start there. And since then, they're noticing more and more that vitamin D allows the body to make better use of phosphorus and calcium and vitamin K and magnesium and other things to build bones. Each of those things are needed, but oftentimes people are the most deficient in vitamin D. So I think I have 300 studies now on the left-hand column that you could look at on vitamin D and bone yes, indeed, it does help an awful lot.
And if you could just briefly talk to the mechanisms, so kind of people understand the sun hits the skin and right through to the kidneys.
Okay. The sun hits the skin, and the body has learned to put a chemical on those parts of your body that will be seeing the skin. It doesn't put it through all your body. It doesn't put it on the lower bathing suit part of your body, for instance, but it puts it very heavily on your face and on your hands and on your feet. And so you'll gain a lot of, when the sun gets the UV there, it creates a vitamin D in the skin, and then as it comes into the skin, it comes that one of these two pathways. Either, well, the pathway here is the skin, the topical, or also you can get vitamin D that you can apply on your skin rather than getting it from the sun. It works pretty well, but then it gets processed through the body primary. A lot of it gets processed through the body, through many of the different cells in the body, but some of it goes through the liver and through the kidneys. That's the classic way that it was thought of as the only way it was thought of 20 years ago that is being processed in the body, but now it's found that majority, maybe 75, perhaps some people say 90% of it doesn't go through the kidneys or the liver and kidneys, but it's processed locally in your muscles and et cetera.
So the kidneys, how does that whole process get regulated, and how does the parathyroid glands kind of fit into that piece?
The vitamin D generated either from you're taking it as a supplement or from food or from topically from the sun or whatever, gets into the bloodstream, and then the classic approach is considered is that the vitamin D then goes into the kidneys, where it becomes, the vitamin D molecule becomes semi-activated by having a little water molecule added onto it. And then it becomes calcidiol, which is shown right here. And that's what you actually see in your blood test, is the amount of vitamin, the level of vitamin D that you see coming out of the liver and seen in the blood test is shown right there. Now, after that, it proceeds on further, and it can be used right there by the body, but some of it needs to be, another water molecule needs to be added on that gets involved in these two genes, and then it becomes calcitriol, which is the fully activated vitamin D which can be brought into the cells and used by the cells.
So it's either calcitriol is either made by the kidneys in the classical pathway of regulating calcium and phosphorus. Right. But above and beyond that, we now know that vitamin D is not only processed by the kidneys, but many other cells
yes.
in the body. And is that kind of where the magic comes into play? And is that how it works? I mean, to say that a lot of people say vitamin D is not a vitamin, it's a hormone. So I guess the pathway that you're showing there shows that sunlight's converted into pre-vitamin D and then taken to the liver, where hydroxyl group is added by an enzyme, and then that is the blood storage form. But from there, it's not only the kidneys that will convert that calcitriol to regulate calcium and ensuring you don't get rickets, but also the other cells in the body possess the ability to grab hold of that storage form of vitamin D and use it for their own requirements.
Right. Most of the cells in the body can actually process the vitamin D as it is originally generated at the top of this slide. In that form, it can be processed by the cells, or it can grab it right there. And in the cell, this is the description of the cell can take that and make it into calcidiol and use some of the parts of the body. The immune system uses this form of vitamin D, and most of the parts of the body uses this form of vitamin D, the calcitriol form of vitamin D. But all of that can be done locally without any kidney or liver involvement whatsoever.
Right, and that's what people, physicians mean when they say that the vitamin D receptor is evident in not just many cells but most cells. Right. Yeah, really.
The vitamin D receptor has been around for, some people say, 750 million years. That animal forms, before they're even having before they're having skeletons, we're using the vitamin D receptor. So it's been a popular thing to have for most animals.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard other doctors and researchers. Dr. Gomanek kind of talks about how uh, vitamin D is indeed one of the oldest hormones on the earth, and enabled our sea-bound ancestors to be able to develop and migrate onto the land. And mineralized calcium in their skeletons, carried around with them, drawing on it when they don't have any available in their diet, and adding to it when they're able to, through that regulation of sunlight into pre-vitamin D, vitamin D, and then its active form. It's just, it really is an interesting background into the subject.
Another little factoid here is that many animals, including humans, have learned how to store vitamin D because they can be in environments, the winter or in a rainy season or whatever, in which they don't get vitamin D every day. So the body has learned how to properly store that. So it makes use of it when it's available. Kind of like the camel storing water. We store vitamin D, but we don't get a big lump because of it.
Mm, and so understanding that vitamin D can be used by many of the cells in the body, what's the benefit, Henry? I mean, most people say, well, who cares? But what is the benefit of the cell being able to use vitamin D in terms of health outcomes?
Here's a list of, okay, there have been a lot of randomized controlled trials in which people having various health problems, half of the people were given, in this case, 50,000 IUs of vitamin D every 2 weeks, and half of them were given a placebo in which there was no vitamin D inside of the pill whatsoever. And so this shows the 27 health problems that have been proven to be treated, prevented, or treated, I use the word fight, by vitamin D. And that's just under this particular amount of vitamin D, 50,000 IUs of vitamin D once every 2 weeks.
I mean,
so on the website, which is meant right here, you can click on it and get the full details of how much of fighting that was involved by having 50,000 IUs of vitamin D.
Yeah, I mean, looking at that list, Henry, here in New Zealand, that list, has got some heavy hitters in there. I tell you, breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, those things are going to ring a note with people. Endometriosis is something that is going to strike a note with people, and multiple sclerosis is going to be something I'm going to ask you about shortly. So a lot of folks are going to watch this and go, well, I'm keen to start supplementing vitamin D, and I pretty much guarantee some of them are going to go and see their doctor and discuss it, and they're going to run into a brick wall. Tell us about, and before we start talking about diseases specifically, why this reluctance when you go to see your family doctor to even have a discussion about vitamin D? It's really difficult. It's like the first barrier I came across back in 15.
There are many, many reasons why the doctors are reluctant to recommend vitamin D. Later on, I'll show you some of the ways you can ask your doctor to do it. But here is one example of a case we made a video out of it, where the doctor got all of his 2,000 patients up to 80 nanograms of vitamin D. And he ran into some problems with this, and most doctors will run into the same problem. He found that the number of visits to his group, that's the reason it had 2,000 people, had quite a few doctors involved, it dropped from 4 visits per year down to 1 visit per year, because the person there with the cast, you still get a broken leg, get a big injury, but the other people that weren't feeling good, they're gone. They are no longer coming to his place. So he actually had to stop his practice because he was no longer earning enough money. Now, most doctors aren't quite so aware that this is the problem, but that's one of the problems that doctors have of recommending some. Okay, doctors are focused on treating problems. They're not focused on preventing problems. That's for human doctors. Veterinary doctors, for animals, especially on farms, they're paid to keep their patients healthy. And so they prescribe on a per pound basis 3 times as much vitamin D as humans get.
That's not the first time I've heard someone talk about veterinary supplementation. Is that correct?
Yeah, but that was one of my first information sources for vitamin D. So I have 160 categories of information on vitamin D. The very first one was veterinary, because they appeared to be, and they still are, about 10 years ahead of the human doctors, because they are paid to keep their patients healthy. They're rewarded.
Yeah, I've got a question about veterinary coming up for you, Henry. But I have to say, across the literature, 80 nanograms per milliliter keeps on popping up here, there, and everywhere as a physiologically significant kind of level to achieve. And I can tell you, once I reach 80 nanograms per milliliter, my cluster headaches cease to be. It's absolutely amazing. So when I started, I was taking significant amounts of vitamin D. What is the go in terms of folks that are watching this that are keen to start supplementing? Is it enough to cruise down to the pharmacy and pick up one of those bottles of 1,000 international units, and are they going to reach 80 nanograms per milliliter? Or what's your view about taking higher amounts when you start supplementing vitamin D in order to reach that level?
That's the whole subject of being on a maintenance level of getting vitamin D versus having a loading dose. First of all, last week a friend gave us a call. They said that they had gotten COVID and what could they do? And I said, hey, you just need to take 200,000 IUs of vitamin D as soon as you can, and it'll go away. Well, the only size she had was 5,000 IUs. So she went ahead and took the 40 pills that she had, and she felt really great the next day and has been doing very fine since then. So it's a little bit of a problem if you are limited as to the size of pill that you have. It's quite a difficulty to try to swallow a lot of pills. So I recommend people have the vitamin D ahead of time to be able to handle emergencies like that. But now going back onto the subject of loading dose and maintenance dose, you can get to an 80 nanogram level of vitamin D, provided you have, I think it's about 7,000, between 5,000 and 7,000 IUs of vitamin D on a daily basis. You'll get there in about 3 to 4 months. But if you want to hurry it up a bit, the body, as I mentioned before, has really learned how to store quite nicely the vitamin D. When it becomes available, it says, I'll take this in, I'll store it away, and can use it again on a rainy day. And so it turns out that you can get your levels up to 80 nanograms or 100 nanograms or for something like that, if you wish, within a few days, instead of having to wait a few months.
And so understandably, for a person that is potentially taking 1,000 international units per day, it's a big jump. And understandably, that person will be like, hold on a minute, 600,000 international, 200,000 international. That's like taking 200 of these pills. Surely that cannot be good for you, cannot be safe. What are you going to say?
Let's look at it in terms of the 200,000 IUs of vitamin D that I recommend for people that having a loading dose. That's the same as if you were on a sunny beach trying to get a suntan on a beach for 10 days in a row, that's about how much vitamin D you get. So it's not that awful excessive. The body is used to being able to absorb that. Now, you don't want to start that off for your skin, as I mentioned earlier, all at once of, I've not been out in the sun at all. I'm going to be out there now for 3 or 4 hours every noontime. Nope, that doesn't work out. You have to kind of gradual up, get it more gradually.
Yeah, okay. As a parallel, in terms of a loading dose for the treatment of cluster headache and migraine, Pete Batchelor's regimen calls for 600,000 international units over 12 days, so 50K a day, and then reduce to 10,000 international units per day in order to maintain your level around 80, and it's worked for many people. Now, I want to talk about raising your levels, because I've noticed some folks elevate very quickly. And as I just said, if I take 600,000 international units, I'm pretty much guaranteed that my level will be somewhere between 80 and 100 nanograms per milliliter. And I want to tell you the story of a friend of mine who also took 600,000 international units in November last year. And he checked his level. It was 21 nanograms per milliliter. He was like, what's going on? At any rate, I caught up with him last week, and he had decided to take 30,000 international units every day since, for a total amount of, get this, 1,560,000 international units, and he rechecked his level. It had risen to 52 nanograms per milliliter. Talk to me about this.
I can't hear you. Oh, you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, some people seem to increase quickly. Some people take like significant amounts of vitamin D, and their levels gradually increase. What's all that got to do with?
There's two things to be discussed in there. One is that there's a huge variability, about a 4-to-1 variability in how much vitamin D you need to get to a certain level. So this little histogram here shows that for some people who are obese and taking 50,000 IUs of vitamin D weekly, as to how much variation they had on how much they gained. Many of them gained sort of like 10 nanograms, but all the ones in the pink section, they actually dropped in their vitamin D levels. But in this other region, you can see that there's a fair amount of range. It's generally acknowledged to be about 4-to-1 for one person that gets 50,000 IUs of vitamin D a week will get to a certain level, but some people will get 4 times as much as that. It varies tremendously between individuals. Fortunately, getting a very high level of vitamin D is not a problem. So it's quite good to recommend to people that they take a certain amount of vitamin D for, say, 3 months, and then get a vitamin D test to confirm that you're in the region that you thought you were expecting to get to. A few people will have to increase it even more than they were taking, because they found that, whoops, I didn't get as much as I was expecting to. Many people say, I got to the level I wanted to get to, say 80 nanograms or 50 nanograms or whatever your goal is, and then you can drop back down to a smaller dosage on a frequent basis, say once a week.
Yeah. And so sticking with my friend's situation, right, I imagine a lot of people who would take kind of 600,000 as a loading dose and then find that their level was still quite low would go, oh, something's wrong here. I've got to stop taking it and not persevere through. So what you're saying is that people that are larger than, obese, require more, and so that could be a reason why his level didn't increase as fast as perhaps what mine did.
So during the last 10 years, I've been documenting the reasons why people have a poor, generally looking at poor response. Slow response is another thing again, but poor response to the vitamin D levels. These are the ones which are, were the prominent ones out of the 40. You can click on the bottom link there to get all the details. But being obese, being elderly, or having a poor gut, you generally need about 2 times more vitamin D or a gut-friendly form. If you have various health problems like autism, anemia, diabetes, some cancers, and about 15 others, you need about double the amount of vitamin D. And then there's magnesium. You don't have enough magnesium or you're smoking, they need a little bit more.
Yeah, and we'll talk about cofactors, but that's not the first time I've seen take your vitamin D with your largest meal. Can you enlighten me as to why that is?
There's probably been 30 studies on that, but intellectually it works out to be pretty easy to understand, is that when you take the vitamin D orally, it gets into your gut and into your intestine, and it's the small intestine that does the absorbing of whatever nutrient you have. And if you think about, and then next meal comes along, whoops, all the stuff goes out of small intestine into the large intestine, and so you're no longer able to access what is there. So if, for instance, you take the vitamin D at breakfast, and then it gets to be in your small intestine for 4 hours, and okay, I'm coming along, I'm getting the vitamin D out of here, but then, whoops, it's getting pushed out, here comes lunch. But for most people, though, the largest meal of the day is supper, so I'll use that as the example. There, the vitamin D gets into your small intestine after supper, and kind of the intestine gets 12 hours to work on getting the stuff out of there, getting all the nutrients out of there. So the largest meal of the day, or actually the meal in which it's the longest time until you have another meal, which is generally considered to be supper for most people, is the best time to take vitamin D, either before the meal or during the meal or after the meal. It's somewhere in that time period.
You've said before to me, Henry, that you cannot just restore the levels to an optimum level. They must be maintained. Now, I know for myself, I take 10,000 international units in order to be able to keep my level at around 80. Talk to me about yourself. Like, what do you need to take in order to stick in the range? And what is that range that you aim to kind of stick around?
As I had been progressing along over the last 12 years now, the vitamin D level that I was trying to achieve, I did. And then I was reading about it that, hey, more is better. Then I tried that, and more is better. I've tried that. And so I'm currently at 200 nanogram level of vitamin D, and that seems enough. It feels very, very good. Anything over about 40 nanograms of vitamin D, though, you need to balance out with the other cofactors, some of which I've got shown on this screen of omega-3 and magnesium are particularly important ones. Vitamin K2, iodine, boron are some of among the lesser ones that need to be balanced out.
I'm still sorry, Henry. I think I'm still in shock. So 200 nanograms per milliliter, and just for any Kiwis that are watching, that's 200 times 2.5. That's 500 nanomoles.
Yes.
Per liter. So it's it's a high level. What do you need to take in terms of a daily or weekly dose to keep your level in that range, out of curiosity?
Taking vitamin D on an irregular basis, not on a daily basis, is the best. Got 16 studies showing that. So I actually take 100,000 IUs of vitamin D once every 4 days. But I would not recommend people to do that just by itself. You have to, at that level of taking vitamin D, add in magnesium as an example. Occasionally I get forgetful and not take the magnesium. I run into some difficulties. But omega-3 and vitamin K2 are also very essential on a long-term basis. Where long-term is, you wouldn't notice the problem of having enough vitamin K or enough omega for probably 2, 3, 4 years. But they starts to have problems like hardening of the arteries, for instance, if you don't have the vitamin K2 in there, if you're above about 40 nanograms.
But before we start asking you questions about cofactors, because it's another piece for people to understand, I want to ask you a question in and around, what is the consequence of keeping your level at a level that is the same all year round? That is, suffice to say, isn't your vitamin D level kind of supposed to change with the seasons? So is there a consideration around being 80 nanograms in the middle of the winter? Wouldn't my body internally be thinking, oh, it's summertime, when in actual fact outside it's winter?
That was what I had asked myself 10 questions about vitamin D when I started, before starting Vitamin D Wiki. That was one of the questions, is should the vitamin D levels go up and down with season? Haven't really got that one answered, but the best I can understand is probably there wasn't a concept of season back when humans were starting off in Africa or other places near the tropics. And then when you had no seasonality, the body went on for 100,000 years or longer of not actually having seasons to have to deal with. So maybe when you're living in a climate further away from the sun, and you've been living, your ancestors have been living there for thousands or tens of thousands of years, maybe you should go up and down with the season. But I haven't really gotten that one understood. I've kind of come to the conclusion, good level all the time.
Okay, thank you. And I'm pleased to know that I'm not the only one kind of rolling that particular question around in my head. Really interested in your comments. If you're watching this, what do you know? Link us a paper and share your thoughts. Now, cofactors, Henry, I think the first two that people talk to me about are you must take your K when you take your D. Some folks say you need to include both fish oil and magnesium, and I know the cluster headache regimen calls for the inclusion of both boron and zinc. Talk to me about cofactors. What are they and what are they doing to support vitamin D?
Let's take magnesium for a moment. Magnesium is involved in the processing of vitamin D at 8 different locations in the body. I was mentioning in the liver and the kidney that it adds in the water molecule to semi-activate or fully activate the vitamin D. Well, magnesium is a catalyst that's involved in doing that. And if the magnesium isn't there, it doesn't get processed as well. So overall, it works out that if you have a low level of magnesium, you need 30% more vitamin D to get to the same level. So that by itself is just saying, if I just looked at that by itself, I'd say, oh, I'll just take more vitamin D. It's cheaper and easier to take than the magnesium. But it turns out there's a lot of other things that goes beyond that in terms of the importance of these other cofactors. Vitamin K, by the way, is an interesting item that I think I've got about 70 studies on vitamin K and vitamin D. Yes, I agree that vitamin K is needed along with the vitamin D. There's some disagreement about its being needed at the same time, because it turns out the vitamin K and vitamin D access the same sort of receptors in various places in the body. And so the vitamin K can actually, if done at the same time, will block the vitamin D somewhat. So it's best to have it on an off day. It appears to, that this data is not finished up on that particular subject.
And omega-3 fish oil, what's the deal?
Omega-3 is both a cofactor for vitamin D, that is to say, it helps with the use of vitamin D in the body, but it is also by itself a very good, healthful thing to have. The omega-3 stops one of its major claims to fame, and I got 150 different studies on this, is that it greatly reduces inflammation of all kinds in the body. Vitamin D decreases inflammation, and they work synergistically together very, very nicely on probably 40 health problems that I've got documented.
And the other smaller ones up on your graphic, Henry, zinc, boron, and is the I for iodine, is it?
Yes, it is.
And so, can folks get what they need out of like I take a men's multi? Is that what we're talking about?
For most people, the boron and the zinc and the iodine are not essential. They are not essential cofactors at all. In fact, when I recommend to people taking vitamin D, I say, hey, let's just go with vitamin D by itself. You're good to go for 6 months, even if you're taking a fair amount of vitamin D. And then you can start to get around to thinking about, let's improve the health even more with magnesium and omega-3 and other things. And I actually rarely get around to recommending people take the boron and zinc. Some people are, anyway, there are other things to do with your health, as this chart was showing. The exercise and healthy foods are more important than all the other things we're talking about.
Yeah, ranked number one and number two. Now, Dr. Stasha Gomanek includes and talks at length about a B50 or 100 complex. Now, that doesn't appear in the circles up on the screen. Just talk to me about your thoughts around vitamin B as a complex to take alongside D.
There are quite a few, not sure where that section is right now. Oh, well. There are quite a few groups that when they are experimenting along and seeing and not being constrained by randomized controlled trials, and they give people a lot of vitamin D, then, that didn't do everything. And then they start to stumble across and say, some of these B vitamins seem to be essential. There's some disagreement between the cluster headache people and the sleep people with Dr. Gomanek and Dr. Coimbra with multiple sclerosis as to how much and what kind of B vitamins are needed. So I don't really have a consensus there. It turns out that between all the B vitamins and is B12 the one that's really needed? That may be the case. I've got about 30 different studies on B12, but sometimes B3 looks important. But just as a general sort of way, many manufacturers have come up with a B50 and a B100. That's what they are, is actually a combination of the B vitamins to the tune of about 50 milligrams each or 100 milligrams each. And you just take that and you say, okay, I don't know exactly how much I want of each of these. I'll just take that. And right. That seems to work out pretty well for most people. It's when you get up to the very high levels with the cluster headaches, multiple sclerosis, et cetera, that maybe getting a particular B vitamin is necessary. But since I haven't gotten a consistency among the different groups as to what B vitamins are needed. I don't have a conclusion as to what specific ones are needed.
And I think it is an area where the literature continues to evolve. It's certainly a fascinating aspect of vitamin D to follow. Yes. I think it was Dr. Gomanek that talks in particular about B5 or pantothenic acid being somewhat involved intricately in the sleep process. Now, Vitamin D itself, in ring number 3 in your graphic. Now, someone told me a couple of weeks ago it comes from lamb's wool grease when you buy it at the pharmacy. I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts about how and where vitamin D comes from. The same person that was talking to me said that if you took one lamb's fleece, it contains enough lanolin to produce 1 million doses of vitamin D3 for human consumption. That's just absolutely outrageous. And I imagine wouldn't cost a lot to produce. Talk to me about how vitamin D is made in the supplement.
Vitamin D can be made from various animal sources. The most popular one by far is getting it from sheep lanolin. Don't have to kill any sheep involved in this, just shave the sheep and you get the vitamin D. You have to go through a fair number of processes to do it. But you get that, and then actually what's involved is it's somewhat like the lanolin. Right there isn't the vitamin D, but they after treating it and getting out the essence of the chemical off of the sheep, then they apply the UV, just as you apply the UV in the skin, and then that creates the vitamin D.
How
so it's got some commonality with the way we do it. It turns out that cats and dogs get the vitamin D the same way, and that's one of the reasons that cats like to lick themselves to get the vitamin D from the fur. Likewise, you can see lots of birds that are preening themselves, and it turns out that they are getting the vitamin D from their feathers. They wouldn't get it otherwise.
Yeah, I don't have any cats, Henry, but I've got 2 dogs. I've got a long-haired border collie, and I've noticed over the past couple of weeks that summer down here, he loves to sit out in the sun. I'm thinking, mate, you must be just roasting. But he's making his vitamin D, is he not?
A few years ago, I did an experiment with a person's cat, and had the cat and had 2 different places for the cat to sit. One place had a sun lamp, and the other place, with the same amount of warmth, had a UV lamp. And it preferred sitting under the UV lamp.
Unreal.
So it was becoming aware of that. There's other examples. Another person in New Zealand actually had a dog that was getting on in years, and gave it vitamin D, and became almost like a puppy in terms of being all energetic again. So,
is that the 17-year-old Labrador named Bo? I think you can read about it on your.
One. Yeah. Yep.
We'll make sure we include that link because it's a really cool story to read, and it just gives you another avenue and angle to appreciate the subject. So, Henry, different forms of vitamin D, D3, D2 from foods, from the sun. What's best? And I preface again this question by saying, if you go to a supermarket in New Zealand and go to buy a packet of mushrooms, they have a prominent label on them promoting the vitamin D. There you go. There's the image up on screen. Talk to me about this. Is vitamin D2 that you'll find in mushrooms, what is that? Why is it different to vitamin D3? And should I be eating more mushrooms?
Vitamin D2 for a fair number of years when I was starting off was looking like it should be as good as vitamin D3, but there have been now well over 50 studies that vitamin D2 is not nearly as good as vitamin D3 for the body, and isn't absorbed as well, and doesn't provide the same kind of benefits. There are a couple of studies that even indicated that taking more vitamin D2 decreases your vitamin D3 levels. So although there are quite a few people that are going for the mushroom form of vitamin D2, it's most likely not the right one to go for. Even the biggest researcher in the world on vitamin D, Dr. Hollick, he was greatly sponsoring vitamin D2 for a fair number of years as I was starting off on Vitamin D Wiki, but he's completely gone away from that now.
Right. And so I know if you go and see a doc in New Zealand, the chances are you will end up with cholecalciferol, vitamin D3.
Yes.
But in other countries, doctors may look to prescribe vitamin D. And when that script is filled at a pharmacy, they may give you D2. Now, talk to me about that. Should folks just be saying, "Hey, I'd prefer vitamin D3, please," or is it no biggie, or what are your views?
It's a large biggie, actually. One of the other aspects of vitamin D2 is it stays in the body for a much shorter period of time. And so for vitamin D2, you have to take it on a daily or at worst every 3-day basis versus vitamin D3 can be taken every 2 weeks or every month. It's stored in the body far better. Body's not used to dealing with vitamin D2. It's far more practiced up, if you will, with dealing with vitamin D3.
And so sticking with the topic of the different forms of vitamin D, when we look at vitamin D3, there's the option of folks going for these liquid emulsions in the dropper bottles or the gel capsules. What's the benefit of going with either or? Would be a question that I ask. Is there any difference at all?
There's some amount of difference between it, but not nearly as large as the difference between vitamin D3 and vitamin D2. There's some difference, and it depends on the person. Sometimes the gel cap will contain a kind of oil that makes it such that the vitamin D is not absorbed by 30% of the population. It gets less than a 20% reduction in the absorption. In some cases, for infants, there used to be a kind of, still is, a kind of vitamin D drop that they would be given that they'd spit back out because they found it just to be incorrect for them. And later on, the research found out why. And so that kind is generally not given anymore. Go back on your comment about the vitamin D2 being prescribed. That again goes back into the 60s or so, in which vitamin D2 was the form to be prescribed, because maybe the reason being, unfortunately, is that the companies got a lot more money out of prescribing D2 than D3. And so the whole doggone chain got going there. There was a fair amount of effort through a friend of mine, actually, who got around to talking to the various drug distribution companies in the United States and making D3 available for the doctors to prescribe. And so now that's pretty much all of the doctors now in the United States prescribe D3, but probably in 40 or 50 countries right now around the world, if the doctor prescribes vitamin D to you, it will be of the vitamin D2 persuasion, because that person didn't get around to telling all the rest of the world.
Right. And look, while we're still on the subject, talk to me about topical D3. You mentioned it earlier, and it just piqued my interest. I know my sister's husband deals with psoriasis. He gets it quite bad. So what is topical vitamin D? Never heard of it before.
Topical vitamin D comes in various forms. It's as a liquid. Some of them have a spray, and some of them is a cream. For myself, I used to have psoriasis on my right knee from a bicycle injury. And it looked kind of yuck. But I found for myself, and many other people do, if you apply the vitamin D to a portion of your skin where you want the skin to be improved, whether it be a psoriasis or a burn or a wart or various other odds and ends, applying it topically, it goes into the body right there. And it appears as though you end up just below the skin with about 100 times more concentration of vitamin D getting there than if you had taken it orally through your mouth and then it finally gets around down to your knee. If you put it directly onto the spot that you want to deal with, it works far, far better.
Right. Now, the next question is a somewhat complicated one, and I still find myself kind of struggling to understand. I wanted to ask you, people talk about genetic polymorphisms, and it's a big, long word, and it sounds super complex, and in and around the genes related to vitamin D metabolism, converting vitamin D from the supplement form into the storage form into the active form. Now, is that something that folks should be worried about before they start taking vitamin D? And what are they?
Actually, some of those genes are mentioned back up here in this other screen. Yes. So the ellipses have the various genes which can increase or decrease the amount of vitamin D that gets into your body. In general, they are not really large amounts, but like for instance, in that the upper two genes there, if you have a poor CYP2R1 or CYP27A1, if those aren't working too well, the amount of vitamin D that you take in through your mouth doesn't get down to your liver. So that's one of the reasons that I was mentioning, the lack of sunshine being one of the reasons for having lower vitamin D. But having a poor gene up there ends up that your blood test isn't as high.
And you know,
and the best solution for that is to take more vitamin D.
Right.
Now, unfortunately, you'll notice most of the ellipses are below the blood test level, so that you can get up to and have, say, a 50 nanogram level of vitamin D. But if you had a poor vitamin D binding protein or a vitamin D receptor gene problem, or some of these others that don't have names, they're just acronyms, you can end up with having not as much vitamin D getting to your to your cells of your body, and that's invisible from the vitamin D test.
So, should people be testing? Well, I mean, can you test for these gene issues? And in your experience, being in the world of vitamin D for a while, how many people might have an issue with their genes related to D metabolism?
Approximately 30% of all people have a problem with the vitamin D receptor. That's where it gets actually into the mitochondria inside of the genes. But it is somewhat difficult to notice or expensive to notice if you have those gene problems, but it doesn't really matter. If you just look at how do I feel, and am I breathing better? Am I having less pain? And other, just getting a feeling for things will summarize all of these and make it so they're not too consequential. There is a specific vitamin D receptor test that you can get. It costs $30. I tested and found out that, oh, rats, I have a poor vitamin D receptor. So independent of the cofactors, there are some things which increase the vitamin D receptor, the activation of that gene. And there's 14 of them that I've got listed currently on the webpage. That is increasing at about one every 6 months recently. And I'm currently doing 9 of them. So I'm kind of covering the bases, or I like to think of it as a shotgun of, I don't know which of these is going to particularly help. I'll do all of them.
Right. Folks would be interested maybe to explore where they can get that test done. Is there a link for more information on genetic vitamin D related testing?
Right. If you click on this link here for more information, that gets you to the part on genes, and there's a large section there on the vitamin D receptor, and that has the information on the vitamin D receptor test, which you can also, by the way, get. There's a gene company, 23andMe, that tests genes, and it in there gets the vitamin D receptor gene. It doesn't say what its current activation is. It says what it should be activated as part of the genes that you got at the time of birth.
Right. I know folks will recognize 23andMe. I know Dr. Rhonda Patrick has talked about that
Yes.
A couple of times before. So there you go. And the link will be there. Now, I'm surprised the people that I talk to, the amount of people that have had issues with their parathyroid glands and in some cases on thyroid hormone daily. Now, those folks, can they still take vitamin D? Is there any considerations for someone that has issues with their parathyroid before supplementing?
I've been down that path a little bit. I've got maybe 30 studies on the parathyroid and thyroid operation, and it seems that's not one of the problems. That's not a concern about your taking vitamin D. There are a couple of concerns of not taking vitamin D. The primary one that I'm quite aware of is with chemotherapy, because the vitamin D enhances about a half of the chemotherapy drugs, enhances them so much that the people can die off because of it. If the doctor doesn't watch the white blood cell level and keeps on giving the certain level of chemotherapy, if the person has a high level of vitamin D, that chemotherapy drug is 2 to 3 times more potent than it would be if not. And so for most drugs, it's nice to have it more potent. Chemotherapy, it's not nice to be more potent.
Right. Okay. That's some good information. In terms of barriers you find in folks starting a supplement like vitamin D now, in 2015, if you'd asked me about it, I would have told you just a waste of money, mate. It'll turn into expensive pee. I make everything I need through eating well and exercising. So what are some of the common barriers that you find in people?
Yeah, there's quite a few barriers that people have and that doctors have. They're down here a little ways. Okay, here are 18 problems that people have barriers for starting vitamin D supplementation. Turns out that all of them are really non-barriers, but you have to think through them and how to deal with them. But like, for instance, some people think you have to get a vitamin D test. No, you don't. It's actually best to not, you don't need a vitamin D test before starting off. It's nice to see what your body's reaction is to the vitamin D level you have and get a test in a few months. But so some people, due to the fear of the needles or a hassle of getting the test or the cost, will say, I'm not going to go to the vitamin D at all because I'm afraid of the test. Some people are afraid of the toxicity. Anyway, there's 18 of the things there, and I've described in detail each one of the 18 barriers if that link right there. This is a summary of several pages of information.
Look, just glancing over that list,
sure.
those I hear them all the time, particularly that one that says you don't need it, you make everything that you need. Which turns out to be not so true at all. So it's really cool that someone watching this is able to go through, click in, and then understanding why that's not quite the case. My next question, I guess, in topic relates to one of those, and that's the concern around toxicity. Now, again, I preface this question and topic by saying there are some pretty severe side effects listed on the New Zealand government's health websites in and around vitamin D. I'll just read a couple out. Adverse effects such as headaches, stomach upset, kidney stones, kidney failure, abnormal heart rhythms. You should only take vitamin D as recommended and prescribed by your doctor. Health Navigator, there's the link. What do you say to that?
Junk. That I'll look at the opposite of some of the reasons people are not wanting to try the vitamin D because they're not sure whether it's going to be helping them or not. And so I've had very good success at having the people take a loading dose of vitamin D and having them personally feel how much better they feel in a week or two. They don't have to have cluster headaches and feel better. They feel better for them. Hey, sometimes it takes a little while and they'll say, doggone, I've got a higher level of vitamin D now. I haven't had any colds or flus during the season. Or I'm just feeling happier during the day, or more alert during the day, or other odds and ends. And I find that getting people past that barrier of trying out a new supplement, and does this help or not? Myself, I've tried out, as I said, hundreds of supplements, and I tend to give up on a supplement if I don't feel for myself that there's some benefit in a couple of months. I know that some of them won't benefit me until decades later, but that tends to be the case for many people, that after they don't feel a benefit, they give up in a few months.
And so toxicity then, Henry, I know that some folks will even say, well, why would you take vitamin D? They give it to bloody possums and rats to poison the things. Now,
Yep.
how many people have hit the hay and passed away from vitamin D overdoses? Is it something, tell me.
Start that perspective in terms of, in the United States, 500 people die from aspirin overdose every year. Now, starting with that perspective of terms of overdose, there have been 0 overdoses to the point of death due to vitamin D, 0 in the last 10 years in the entire globe. So it is a rare, rare thing.
And so if that was a barrier for someone, I'm scared to take higher dose toxicity, is probably not something that you should be concerned about. Quickly, talk to me about, why are they knocking out possums and rats and mice with vitamin D, cholecalciferol? Well, what's the deal there?
Well, it would knock you out too if you took equivalent of about 10 million IUs each meal. That's what the rats and the possums are getting. And that would be very hard on you. You're somewhat larger than a possum or a rat. That would be very hard on you. And yes, 10 million IUs of vitamin D on a maybe several times a day basis, or even a daily basis, is a big problem. And if you look at that in terms of IUs per kilogram of body weight, that's how it works out. That yes, at really high doses, it does cause problems. But that's, by the way, that was one of the things I looked at many years ago, looking at 50,000 IUs of vitamin D in a bottle. It turns out that you can consume that entire bottle in a single day and not have a problem. You'll feel a little off, but not enough that you have to go to the hospital or anything. But if you took 10 of those bottles every day, that would cause a problem.
So I want to talk to you about disease burden, in particular with a lens to the things that affect my fellow New Zealanders. Now, I've said a couple of times throughout this interview that my cluster headaches were resolved with vitamin D. I do not get them anymore. Henry, tell me, what other diseases respond to vitamin D?
So here are, just taken from the left-hand column of Vitamin D Wiki, here are the top health problems in terms of the number of studies for each of those, starting with autism in the upper left-hand corner at 138 studies, bone health 285, and going on down to trauma and surgery at 300. So that's give you a little feeling as to how well that has been studied. Pregnancy, turns out vitamin D is very useful before, during, and after pregnancy. 793 studies.
I have been told women really need to watch out if they're taking vitamin D. Make darn sure that you're taking birth control that increases fertility in both males and females. You talk to me about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, zoos learned quite a few decades ago that they become a birthing factory if they give vitamin D to their animals. That it greatly increases the fertility. In one of the studies I was noticing that if you increase the vitamin D level to 50 nanograms for both the mother and the father, it increases the net fertility by a factor of 4. Also, you end up with much healthier children as a result.
Before we talk more about pregnancy, one of the things that caught my eye on that list, multiple sclerosis. I know a couple of friends that are going down this journey right now. Talk to me about, I've said again, really worked very, very well for cluster headache. Are we talking about some efficacy and help here? Are we talking about remission in some case? How far does this thing go?
The multiple sclerosis is one of the poster childs for vitamin D, in as much as by having a high dose of vitamin D and through a particular protocol called the Coimbra protocol that's now being done by over 20,000 people around the world, they find that their multiple sclerosis essentially completely goes away. That is to say, many testimonials I've got on my website, but an example one is the person had been a runner and then got multiple sclerosis and was in a wheelchair and barely able to move around, got the high dose vitamin D, and she's off back being a runner running 10 miles a day. There are hundreds of testimonials like that. There's also many on the website of people looking at the brain scans of the people with multiple sclerosis and showing the white areas in which the brain isn't working anymore. And then they give them the high dose of vitamin D and all the white areas go away and they're thinking again and operating, walking, running, jogging just fine afterwards. It has caused me to wonder about how many other of the diseases on this page would get really cured by a high amount of vitamin D.
Yeah, and so let me ask you then, correlative or causative? I know a lot of academics maybe watch this and go, it's all very well to say, list a whole lot of topics and say that vitamin D is at the root of it all. Now, they're going to say correlative does not mean causation.
Right. That is a very important concern. That chart I had here, nope. This one. All of these health problems that are listed here were found through randomized controlled trials of giving 50,000 IUs of vitamin D once every 2 weeks or a placebo to hundreds or thousands of people and finding the benefit in the vitamin D. That kind of eliminates the whole problem of as correlation versus causation, because the vitamin D caused that health problem to go down, to go away, or decrease in various ways. You have to look at the details of each one of them, but it's that level. I think I've got 750 randomized controlled trials concerning vitamin D. I also have over 500 meta-analyses of which are summaries, overviews of randomized controlled trials on vitamin D. And they're virtually all showing that it really helps a lot.
So sticking with pregnancy, you made a comment some time ago when we were having a talk around 6,500 international units kind of being a good dose for a woman that's carrying a baby. Is that because, baby sucking a bit of vitamin D out of mum and using that for, just talk. I'm such a novice in that area. Talk to me about what you understand about reproduction and vitamin D.
Consider reproduction being a little bit different than pregnancy. Let's concentrate on the pregnancy aspects of it. There are a whole bunch of trials that Dr. Hollis and Dr. Wagner sponsored quite a few of them, ran quite a few of them, and they've tried different levels of vitamin D, giving them to women, and found that they are having really good success on average across all the different women at 6,500 international units of vitamin D daily for the pregnant woman. In terms of decreased health problems, hypertension kind of things, preeclampsia, decrease in stillbirths, decrease in various other things during the pregnancy, and then afterwards ending up with a much healthier infant.
So my wife was born, my stepson was born by cesarean section. I have read a couple of articles on your site that that talk about that aspect as well, and that the lower the vitamin D serum, the increased risk of having a cesarean section. So just why wouldn't...
There's specific randomized control trials specifically on that the women who got the vitamin D ahead of time, or early on in the pregnancy, were significantly, I've forgotten the factor, I think it's about a factor of 2, less likely to need a cesarean section afterwards. It helps broadly across a whole lot of health problems concerning pregnancy.
And so really those questions have been focused on mum. What's vitamin D's role in kind of fetal development and, the health of your beautiful new baby? What are the considerations there? What are your understandings and thoughts?
I'll add a graphic in on the transcript on this. There's an excellent graphic showing the development of the infant from being a couple of cells to being to birth level, and the various parts of the body that are developed during that time and how vitamin D helps out during each of those different periods. You don't, for pregnancy, you just don't add vitamin D during the 3rd trimester. You want to add it actually before conception is best, but as soon as possible of knowing about pregnancy, adding the vitamin D is very, very important.
And in a world bent up on being equal, please talk to me about my considerations as a bloke. What does vitamin D do to my reproductive system? My testes, Henry.
Right. Well, it makes for much healthier swimmers of the sperm. And they survive better and they work better there. But I can also relate that makes sex a lot better too. It feels better. It's, I think, better than, I don't know, but better than Viagra or other things.
Now, this next question, you don't even have to answer it if you don't want to, but my mind wanders. I'm the kind of guy that thinks about things off the beaten track, and sticking with reproduction and whatnot, your views on sexuality. Is there any correlation? I know, for example, Dr. Walter Stumpf published at length regarding the brain as a sex organ. What are your views? Do you think this may be in a kind of an emerging field we learn more about in the future, vitamin D sexuality?
Most likely. So far, all I can see is positive indications in terms of sexuality and vitamin D. I've seen nothing negative whatsoever. And so I'm leaning to saying, oh, that's probably a good thing. You mentioned there concerning the vitamin D in the brain. It turns out that the brain-blood barrier that one hears about, vitamin D has a little difficulty getting into the brain. So some Alzheimer's researchers said, how can we get vitamin D into the brain? How to better get it? And so they found that, there was a way of getting some chemicals into the brain. Cocaine users sniff the cocaine, and it gets past the blood-brain barrier. There's a particular place through the nose nerves that the chemical go in. And so they did an experiment with mice of having them inhale vitamin D. And with the idea, what they were trying to do is, how can we decrease the likelihood of getting Alzheimer's? And they found that, inhaling vitamin D allows more vitamin D. They actually tested the vitamin D levels in the brain of the mice after inhaling that way. It gets more vitamin D in. So they were happy, and they're going off and doing other things. But that brings up that study kind of tweaked to my interest. And so I ended up making a vitamin D inhaler and have been using it myself now for the last 4 or 5 years.
There's two aspects to that, and I want to park the inhaler, and I want to park the that philosophical piece in and around the brain as a sex organ and the brain and vitamin D, because I think it's very, very interesting, and it can be seen from quite a spiritual perspective. But I want to stick with disease burden, and in particular, obesity and diabetes. Just over 1 in 3 Kiwis, Henry, are overweight. 34% of our population, and I know many watching this wouldn't possibly mind losing a little bit of weight. What are your views? Is there a specific level or threshold where metabolism starts to get influenced by vitamin D? I know Dr. Judson Somerville's book talks about weight loss and vitamin D. What are your views?
The more vitamin D you can have, the less your diabetes. That has been shown by over 100 different randomized controlled trials. The obesity, there's some other complications of the causes of obesity that would take another whole hour to describe in any kind of detail. But in terms of weight loss, that's been a little bit better described. And I've got, I think, a link on this page here, but I'll add it later if not, that the people who want to lose weight, they have to do something in addition to taking vitamin D. Just taking vitamin D itself doesn't really do it, but if they add exercise or if they reduce calories, they will lose an extra 10 to 15 pounds of weight during that time period in which they were doing the randomized controlled trial. And most interestingly, having the higher level of vitamin D allows them to keep the weight off, because that's a frequent problem that people have of the yo-yo diet problem of, I'll go on a diet and then I'll lose some weight, and then, okay, I'll go off the diet, whoops, all the weight comes back, and sometimes even more. But if you do that same process, go on a diet and add vitamin D, and then when you go off the diet, you won't gain the weight back nearly as much.
And how does diabetes kind of fit into this picture?
Unfortunately, I don't have a mental model that I can describe as to how diabetes is involved with vitamin D. I can't remember what's on my webpage on diabetes right now. I don't have a good memory for all of those, but I do know that those people who were either in the category who were pre-diabetic, and then they took half of them and gave them vitamin D and the other half not. The ones who were pre-diabetic, the ones that didn't get the vitamin D went on to become diabetic. The ones that did almost entirely did not go on to get diabetes. So that's at one level of diabetes. The people who are diabetic and take vitamin D, it decreases many of the symptoms or the problems that people experience with diabetes.
And again, there's a section on your site.
Yeah, there's a section on the site there that's got 250 or 300 different studies on diabetes and vitamin D.
Now, in terms of, sticking with gastrointestinal, exploring and fleshing that out,
Yep.
I know so many people with IBS. It's just very, very common. Colon cancer, second largest leading cause of cancer death in New Zealand, above and beyond which I haven't told you, but I'm an ex-chef of 15 years. And I can tell you that when I started cooking, I wasn't getting the level of orders that I got towards the end of my career saying, staggering, allergic to this, cannot have that, no, this, no, that, no, this, no, that, no.
Yep.
Why this increase, and is it related to vitamin D? Have you got literature that people can explore on this topic?
I have many charts of showing the huge increase in IBS, in multiple sclerosis, in cluster headaches, in sleep problems, in fertility problems, in psoriasis, all of which have gone up. I've got several different pages. It has gone up a factor of 2 to, in some cases, a factor of 30 during the last 40 years. And every single one of them are related to having a decrease in vitamin D level. For instance, and doctors are slow at doing this, an example there on the colon cancer, there have now been 22, I believe it is, meta-analyses, all of which have found that a higher level of vitamin D decrease the likelihood of the person getting colon cancer or decrease the problems of the colon cancer. Unfortunately, there's a huge industry involved in treating colon cancer, not preventing, treating. And there's been a great reluctance by those people who have studied and are experts being colon cancer experts. They'll go out of business if the people get vitamin D. People are starting to notice that this is helping out. For instance, on multiple sclerosis, that particular one, I was just seeing a recent one that some Blacks who are getting multiple sclerosis, they had it was a 16 times increase in the amount of vitamin D that they're getting. They elected to do themselves. Their doctors weren't saying it. They elected to do because they're starting to hear about it. I'm imagining there's sort of something similar to that in cluster headaches happening and sleep and some of these other things.
100%, because, it is unbelievable how this whole thing is patient-led. We know it works. It's worked for over 3,000 of us cluster heads now. And so it really is. And it's a really interesting aspect as this thing moves forward. It is being led by the people talking about it amongst themselves and just increasing that awareness. In and around one of the fascinating kind of topics I've followed and with great interest was learning about Weston Price. Now, for those of you who don't know, Weston Price is probably one of the earlier names in the early 1900s that discovered the benefits of sunshine on oral health. Fast forward today, you can search YouTube and you will find, for example, a dentist by the name of Joe Gold talks at great length about vitamin D and oral health. What are your views about oral health? And talk to me about fluoride.
As I mentioned earlier, the American Dental Association was greatly promoting vitamin D in the 1930s. Unfortunately, some people came along and pointed out to the dentist that, hey, if you apply fluoride topically to your patient's teeth, that will decrease the amount of cavities. And then they flip-flopped in about a 10-year time period, and then they're all pro-fluoride. Unfortunately, since that turnover, the people, they've started getting around to including fluoride in toothpaste. And so people were getting the fluoride that way. And it turns out it's not nearly as beneficial for oral health as the vitamin D is. But that's various dentists around the world, and I'm in contact with some of them, are increasing the vitamin D level in their patients. And they're finding that, hey, they're having fewer gum problems, they're having fewer broken teeth, they're having fewer cavities, on and on and on. The dental implants even work better. Just when they're trying to insert a false tooth as a sort of stake it in there, they find that applying a little layer of vitamin D to the tooth, the stake before they put it in there, makes it so it isn't rejected nearly as much.
How interesting. And I recall in my interview with Judson Somerville, he mentioned vitamin K as well in and around periodontal disease. He said, watch out, the periodontists aren't going to want to like me much. They're going to go to business as people discover vitamin K is amazing for that condition. Speaking with Dr. Somerville, in his interview I did with him, he mentioned to me that his practice went from one of the highest prescribers of antidepressants in the tri-state area to the lowest after introducing vitamin D into their clinical practice. Now, in NZ, I can tell you mental health is a massive, massive concern. I've got a report here, Ministry of Health 2018, mental health issues and problems on the rise, particularly amongst young people. Now, I know vitamin D is not the whole perspective on this very complex issue around mental health, but please share your thoughts with me around mental health and vitamin D.
Well, as the chart I have right there, for instance, on depression, it appears to go through many different studies. Well, this is how much vitamin D you need to deal with various problems. Rickets is at the lowest at 30 nanograms. If you bring the child who has rickets at the 30 nanogram level, the rickets goes away. Depression, it's about 40 nanograms, and then great decrease in depression. More is better, but it's a good point to go at. 50 nanograms, COVID-19, fertility and psoriasis are some of the ones that are fought quite nicely by 50 nanograms. Sleep seems to need about 70. Cluster headaches needs about 80. Multiple sclerosis needs about 150. So,
and what do you think the mechanism is? I'm really keen to get your perspective, and I'll just make some comments around mental health from the perspective of some of the other researchers I've followed, and that is to say that vitamin D is very much a signaling molecule, and it is your body's physiological way of knowing what season it is outside. And so Judson Somerville, for example, talks about folks being in a winter syndrome where their vitamin D level is so low that they're physiologically, their body believes that they are stuck in an endless winter. And so elevate them out of that winter range kind of naturally to me. I feel really good in the summer, don't we all? We love going to the beach and we love, that kind of, it just makes us feel good. And I just wondered what your views were from that aspect.
I think that's a good indication of how the body tells you that you're doing a good thing. It's kind of like the cat and the dog likes to get out, or the cat particularly likes to get out in the sunshine or get some warmth and feels good. Likewise, humans, pretty much all humans on Earth and most religions kind of revere the sunshine. There's probably, if you think about it a little bit, there's probably some connection there between improved health and having sunshine. For a long time, when I was growing up, it was considered to be a good sexual thing, that a person looked more sexually attractive if they had a good suntan. And there's kind of a relationship there that, hey, if you have a good suntan, that's an indication you're generally looking healthier for other reasons than just the tan. You're looking brighter and happier and such.
And more vital.
Yep.
Vitality of life. Talking about those that have the vitality of life amongst them, I wanted to let you know I had someone contact me recently whom had started taking high dose vitamin D, and their commentary to me, Henry, was that they had very rapidly and very quickly increased their daily run stretch from 15 kilometers to 30 kilometers, and noted with an absolute ease. They said to me, Craig, I'm just absolutely amazed at the lack of muscle recovery and soreness the next day. Henry, talk to me a little bit about sport and nutrition. There will be people, will folks see benefits like this when they take vitamin D?
I didn't mention it in here. It was running out of room of 50 nanograms, but many professional sports teams and clubs around the world have come to see the benefits to their players in terms of performing better, jumping better in basketball, running for a longer period of time without soreness, having fewer injuries, recovering from the injuries more quickly, all of which comes across basketball, hockey, football, soccer, gymnastics, taekwondo, quite a few others have all found that 50 nanograms helps tremendously for sports people.
So I sent the particular gentleman to your website, to the wiki, and he contacted me shortly afterwards to say that he'd found the papers that he was looking for, and again wanted to thank me for introducing him to the vitamin D world. Now, look, sticking with sports and nutrition, shock horror, drop the mic. Henry, talk to me about inhaled vitamin D. What the absolute hang? I've never heard of it before. People are going to be tearing their hair out about this one. Please talk to me about this.
There's inhaled vitamin D that going on. I'd mentioned that study that the Alzheimer's researchers did with the mice to get more vitamin D into the brain. And then I being a connoisseur of interested in all things vitamin D, I said, what if you could, and so they had the mice inhale the vitamin D. I said, what if I could inhale the vitamin D? So I proceeded to just buy some stuff on Amazon, some nano-emulsion vitamin D, added a little bit of water to it, and bought some of these inhalers. I actually own 15 of them now. I've been lending them out to people, and it works out very nicely. And one can inhale vitamin D, and surprisingly, and I've not gotten an understanding why, but as it says at the top here, I find that inhaling only 500 IUs of vitamin D, a really small amount, greatly improves my breathing ability and my ability to exercise tremendously, such that I rarely do any form of intense exercise without inhaling vitamin D about 5 minutes before the intense level. So it's something simple that you go to my website here for more details. It gives all the details about how, the inhalers cost between the mister costs between $9 and $25. The particular model that I seem to really like costs $22. That's the one that's pictured. And it's a nice thing to do. There's no company selling it whatsoever. But I've been hoping that would happen, but it hasn't.
Well, the details are on the site. I'm sure that there is going to be someone that knows someone that talks about this thing, that tries it and says, oh my goodness. And so this could be something that we hear more about in the near future. look, I wanted to and have so far stayed well out of the discussion on my podcast about vitamin D and COVID-19. It's come to the point, Henry, I can't ignore it any longer. I've got my friends, my family, visitors to my website asking me about vitamin D and COVID-19. Look, it's just become so politicized that you risk falling on one or the other side of the fence and offending people. My interest is purely scientific. I want to read. I want to know what the literature is saying, and I know you're a details guy. Talk to me about COVID-19 and just give it to us. What is the literature saying? Where are we at?
Yes. Okay, there's many studies that have found that COVID-19, you have a less chance of getting it, and you have a better chance of surviving it if you take. There's a whole variety of different items. Ivermectin is one, vitamin D is another, omega-3 is another. Resveratrol is another. There's quite a few different ones. I happen to know a lot about the vitamin D part with COVID-19, and it greatly decreases the chance of getting COVID. And also, if you start to get COVID, if you take a very high dose of vitamin D, every person that I've recommended that to, their COVID symptoms virtually vanish within 3 days. So it is very good in terms of instantaneous sort of thing, or be able to have, I call it emergency vitamin D for COVID.
So in terms of following the literature and seeing what has been posted on, PubMed and various boards, is that information collated on the Vitamin D Wiki so we can kind of
yes,
see?
There's a whole section that has, I think there's 700 different studies now concerning COVID, of which on my Vitamin D Wiki site, of which about 600 of them are vitamin D, and the 100 other are some of the other ways of preventing or fighting COVID.
Right. And so specifically sticking with vitamin D, that's a lot of papers for people to kind of, I guess, be across. Is there any organization that is looking at all of these papers and kind of running a current and up-to-date meta-analysis of?
There's quite a few. There's one particular one that does an excellent review of, I think it's 23 different things that seem to be useful to prevent or fight COVID. And they nicely have they update their information, and it's extremely in good detail. I don't try to duplicate it at all, but they nicely update the information in a graphic form. And I've got it on my website that their information is updated on my page every single day. And so if you go at it today, it will show today's date, whenever it is, as to what the latest information is on all of those different ways of fighting COVID.
And, COVID-19 aside, it always bemuses me, Henry. I see news articles, and I'm going to put some headlines, typical headlines from New Zealand news publications that folks will see every single winter. Look, let me read. Health authorities brace for,
You had shown me the headlines earlier. There's some of the.
So can you tell me why is it that we as humans associate winter with a more severe or greater outbreaks of respiratory kind of type viruses, colds, flus, you name it? Why is that happening in winter?
There are many different. Most people agree that there is something about winter that causes increased flus and colds. That's acknowledged. Now comes the disagreement as to what the reason is, or is there a single reason, or are there multiple ones? Everything I've seen so far is that vitamin D is a very significant reason for that increase in flus and colds, the lack of vitamin D that happens when you're not out in the sun as much. Oh, by the way, one of the indications of that is that it's in terms of, it's not, so some people say it's the temperature, some people say it's the lack of sunshine, some people say it's the humidity. An example in the Middle East, there they have such intense sunshine that they stay out of the sun so much during the summer that that's when they get their flus and colds. So to me, that was a good example of maybe it has to be the lack of the UV and the vitamin D that's causing the flus and colds, because for them, they run between their building and their car and hit their air-conditioned car and then run, not just walk, run to get into their home because it's such intense sunshine.
Right. You know, it's almost staggering if there is a correlation or indeed a causation in and around vitamin D serum level, how much vitamin D is in your tank heading into winter. And if you didn't increase or elevate your level when the sun was shining, then you're more at risk of having a bout of cold or flu over the winter season.
Or another example comes from multiple sclerosis. The Army has been, U.S. Army has been testing, noticing the amount of multiple sclerosis they got from the people who lived in the southern part, closer to the equator in the United States versus far away from the equator. There used to be about a 20-to-1 difference in the amount of people with multiple sclerosis who were volunteering to become soldiers. That was the case up until about 40 years ago. Then air conditioning came along, and people in the southern part of the United States were no longer having to get too hot in the summer, and because they're able to stay inside with the air conditioning. And now it's just about level in the United States. The same amount of people volunteering to go into the Army from the Florida, which is the closest to the equator, versus Maine, which is the furthest from the equator in the United States. They have about the same level of multiple sclerosis versus it used to be, an order of magnitude difference between the two.
Again, New Zealanders watching this as we kind of discussed multiple sclerosis from incidence rates from a United States perspective. You can do a simple Google search and reveal the data for MS incidence rates in New Zealand, and the data is pretty starkly clear that incidence rates increase the further south you go. Yes. In New Zealand.
I've got maps like that for lots of countries. A very good one I can remember from the UK, that down in London, they got a certain level of multiple sclerosis, but up in Scotland, I think it's 5 times higher. But the same sort of thing happens in various places, but some of that goes away, that differential, as you get more and more air conditioning.
And look, as we kind of move on to a summary and philosophical section, the first question I wanted to ask you, and again, I'm a weird dude, I think about strange things. I've always wondered about astronauts. You've worked in the aeronautical space before, the colonization of other planets and vitamin D. Is this something these guys are even thinking about? To astronauts, for example, that are working up at the ISS supplement vitamin D, do you know?
NASA, for a long time with the people up at the International Space Station, gave the people no supplement whatsoever. Then they finally got around to the only supplement they gave to the astronauts was vitamin D. And then I went, and then the finding that they're increasing the amount of vitamin D that they're recommending to the astronauts. I went through a calculation, and okay, it costs a lot of money to have an astronaut up there. The commute charge is really expensive, and the supply chain and everything else is really expensive, such that I've forgotten the exact numbers, but it's of the order of $100,000 a day to have a person up there. So I went through a simple little calculation about a year and a half ago, and looking at how much more productive the astronauts would be in terms of running their science experiments, which is kind of the reason for being up there. How much more productive they would be in not having colds and flus and feeling better, et cetera. And it was a huge, just fantastic amount of money that they could save or increase productivity if they gave them an adequate amount of vitamin D instead of, I think it's 600 IUs is what they were originally giving them.
The problem here on Earth, it's not just relegated to the folks working that science up at the International Space Station. The metaverse is something that I'm hearing about more and more. Alongside Elon Musk's aspirations to colonize other planets. Do you think innovators of our 21st century, like Mark Zuckerberg, have considered vitamin D and their process, looking at the metaverse where we exist virtually with a headset on? What would be your message to them?
You have increased productivity and health of people no matter where they are, whether they're shut-ins and not getting outdoors at all, they're elderly, they're astronauts, anywhere else, that as a single supplement to be given, vitamin D would help a tremendous number of people wherever they are under the water. In the Antarctic, they're finding the vitamin D helps also, by the way. It just helps tremendously in lots of different places.
We talked about domesticated animals and the fact that you've got a veterinarian section on the D Wiki, which I know some folks are going to head over and check out. Now, I've spoken about Dr. Gomanek previously, and I think one of the things she eloquently talks about is the migration, hibernation, or the living off reserves in relation to vitamin D, the sun, and the animals and the creatures that live on the earth. I think this is really interesting. Can you just talk about the equator and those three aspects, hibernate, migrate, live off reserves?
Not too well. I don't have that much information about it, unfortunately. I would be interested, by the way, I haven't looked for it yet. I would suspect that you will find for cluster headaches that there's been a great increase in the incidence of cluster headaches since the 1950s. And that vitamin D is perhaps a major cause for that happening. There's a couple of other things like zinc and magnesium that may also be, and omega-3 that may be there, that there's been some changes in the since then, but vitamin D is a primary item.
Like I said to you before the interview started, I've had I just have so many people reaching out to me here in New Zealand regarding cluster headache. It'll be something that I look up in terms of incidence rates and maybe blog post in future about that. But it leads me to asking you, Henry, what's the way back for us? It's almost like, and I'm sure the viewers, if they've followed and kind of grasped the idea of why we're deficient in vitamin D, what's the way back for us as a species? What needs to change in order for us to wake up and realize that we are living so out of whack with nature, that we're so off course? Philosophically speaking, doesn't this leave you with a I guess, a sense of melancholy as to where our species is at?
It's beyond melancholy. For quite a few years while doing Vitamin D Wiki, I thought, oh, if they just got a little bit more proof to the doctors, they would see that seems to be something which is useful to do. But I've come to the conclusion starting about 4 years ago that no, you need to follow the money or see who's going to benefit from it. And if you're adding vitamin D, the health people do not benefit from it. They will decrease the number of jobs that they have. Oh, one local example in Australia, they're near to New Zealand. They noticed that there was a 10 times increase in the total IUs sold to Australia over a period of 10 years, a 10 times increase. This is not due to the doctors doing it, but they found that there was a 30% decrease in the number of osteoporosis visits after that 10 times increase in vitamin D. We're seeing some of that happening at the grassroots level around the world. I mentioned there multiple sclerosis, the blacks getting multiple sclerosis, they greatly increase their vitamin D levels. Same thing happening with Parkinson's disease. I've got that documented, that people who are getting Parkinson's without their doctors recommending it or looking on the internet and other places and saying, hey, this might help me. And they're taking a whole lot more vitamin D. Unfortunately, not quite enough to make a big improvement, but it does help them somewhat. That's going on and on through many diseases. Generally, where looking at the people or the groups, the individuals who benefit from it, they are doing it. The people who don't benefit from it, the health insurance companies, the hospitals, the doctors, many times they have negative reasons for going ahead for taking vitamin D. So I've kind of given up trying to convince the health professionals and focusing now more on, as you are, having the individuals consider it for themselves. For some people, my son, for instance, he's much younger than I am. He took the extra vitamin D and he didn't notice any difference, but he's also younger. And as you get older, your vitamin D levels get worse and worse. And he wasn't having any health problems at all. Excuse me, he did have one health problem. He was having allergies, and all the allergies have gone away now. He had allergies to pollen, for instance. But he doesn't particularly acknowledge that particular item. But so my recommendation is, as I have here on slide number 20, start by restoring your vitamin D levels with 4 pills, and do that for a couple of months. And at the end of that couple of months, decide for yourself, did that help me? If it didn't help, then don't continue on with it. But if it did help, which is in most cases what will be the case, then go ahead and proceed on, as I have on the page here, of adjusting your vitamin D level as to what you actually have.
Tell me, sharing this information isn't without its perils. Have there been any challenges over the years in terms of getting this information out there and censorship?
No, there's not been. There has been extreme censorship on some of the COVID-19 alternative treatments like ivermectin. There's been calling it the horse dewormer is a particular outrageous thing, because actually it's just 10 times the number of humans get ivermectin as do horses. But doesn't matter.
Really interesting that whole topic, and we're certainly not going to wade into that debate. But look, I'm really interested to hear where to from here for the wiki. Have you got any exciting projects or developments on the horizon?
The one that I had given myself a New Year's resolution for January 20th was to get some employers. I've got all the documentation of how much, if they gave free vitamin D to all of their employees, how much more productive the employees would be, that they would not be out with colds and flus, would not be sharing the colds and flus with their other employees, would feel more productive and alert, et cetera. I've got some pretty intense documentation showing that that would save quite a lot of money. Just ignoring the decrease in cluster headaches, migraine headaches, and other things. Just some very simple, basic things. But then COVID came along and I got distracted by that. I'm hoping to get back to it soon, pointing that out. But I figure it's going to take quite a lot of effort to do that.
I think, best laid plans at times, Henry. We certainly got thrown a curveball, and it appears doesn't matter where you live. None of us kind of got off lightly in terms of the disruption to normal life. There's a ton of good videos out there, and interviews on vitamin D. If there was one that you would recommend to folks that want to watch something else, what would that be?
I've got my website's got listed, I think, 120 videos concerning vitamin D. In terms of a very short one, I think the one we produced 5 or 6 years ago was pretty good. I'd shown you the case there with the 80 nanogram, the doctor that got to 80 nanograms and so many fewer people, but it describes in there the details about how you get vitamin D from the sun and the health problems associated with having low vitamin D, et cetera. So that's a nice 5-minute summary.
I'm calling that the best 5.5-minute video on the internet. Hands down, it's one that you will want to share with your friends when you see it. It's on the wiki. It's linked on my channel. Go and watch it after this. You'll thank me later, I assure you. Finally, Henry, what would be your message to someone that is new to this, that's watched the video, that may be dealing with one of the conditions that we've kind of touched on? Where to from here for that person?
It's kind of this is the summary one of that. If you think it's going to help, do not just try a certain amount, whatever amount, on a daily basis, because you will lose interest in trying that on a daily basis, because humans just don't notice it takes a while for it to build up in the body normally. But go after it in terms of like getting a good suntan or being out on the beach and going on a sunny vacation. Consider that, but instead of going on a sunny vacation, you only have to take 1 pill every 2 weeks. And that is a little tiny pill that is very easily consumed with your meal. If you don't like taking pills, you can even open up many of the capsules and just pour it into your food or your drink and take it that way. It's totally tasteless. And then just do that for a couple of months. You start with the restoring and you should feel better. Get your own personal feeling. Doesn't make you feel better in a couple of weeks. And then if it is, well, continue on doing that, the 1 pill every two weeks for a couple of months, and then fine tune it by getting a vitamin D test and saying, oh, is it likely that I could, okay, the vitamin D test says I'm at 30 nanograms and I should be at 50 or 80 nanograms, but I'm still feeling good. So maybe I need more, but also maybe to the point of I'm feeling really good and I'm at a high level of vitamin D. I don't have to continue at this level. I can drop down a little bit.
And so anything that we've talked about today that you've seen, if you're watching this, Henry has very kindly linked all of this information in one page. So you can go to the section where we, for example, talk about cluster headache, click on the link and go and view the literature on the Vitamin D Wiki. Is there anything you'd like to add, Henry?
Yeah, but it takes about another 10 hours, so this is sufficient. I was thinking about all of the other things that could be talked about, but at a certain level, I think this deals with the what people can try for themselves, and look up for your particular health problem. I've got 100 and some, maybe it's 120 or 30 now, health problems listed on the left-hand column, and look at if for a particular health problem you have or that runs in your family, and take a look and see what the studies are actually showing. Being an engineer, I'm extremely data oriented, so I don't really like to look at people's hints or ideas, or gee, this individual found that XX helped them. I take very little interest in that. In fact, for a long time, I've taken the policy of, if I come along with a single study on a particular disease that's finding vitamin D helps, I don't put that on the website just from a single study. I don't trust any single study. So many things could be right with it or wrong with it. But I generally will start to put the study on the Vitamin D Wiki after I've seen 5 studies, and at least 3 of them say that vitamin D is a significant help. I'm allowing that there'll be some disagreements. Generally, rarely will it say that the vitamin D hurts. There are 1 or 2 that they claim, I'm not too sure about it, that the vitamin D got the problem worse, but generally it's saying, hey, they added the vitamin D, nothing helped. But oftentimes when I look at them, yeah, they added 500 IUs of vitamin D. One of them added 30 IUs of vitamin D, and it didn't help that particular problem. And so they say vitamin D doesn't help at all.
And so you will not find a study like that on your site. So you're looking.
You'll find a couple. Just for flavoring, I throw a couple of those in each month of the ridiculously small amounts or small durations that they'll run a test in which they'll give a good amount of vitamin D, but they'll run the entire test will be over in 1 month. At which point, vitamin D level will not have even gotten up to the maintenance level that is needed, and they'll say at the end of that 1 month that vitamin D didn't help with this particular problem. There are lots of trials like that.
And so it's somewhat assuring then that I know the collection you've got there is somewhat curated, and the papers have been viewed with an analytical, the critical eye that you would expect from someone that's been an aircraft engineer for his working life. Look, Henry, as a person that knows the wiki inside and out, bless you, sir. For the work you are doing there. I know it comes at a cost of time, and I also know that you've invested a lot of your own finances in getting the message out. So I am absolutely certain that you will be kindly rewarded when you approach those pearly gates many years from now. If you've been watching the show, you like and subscribe. We'll have more from Henry Lahore. The links in the description, and go and visit the Vitamin D Wiki. It is just a sensational place. Henry, my good man, thank you.
Yep. Bye.